Chapter 1. The Garden Fete. The summer sun shone with particular kindness upon Willowbrook that Saturday afternoon, and the church green was a scene of colour, chatter, and gaiety. The annual fete, long anticipated, had drawn nearly every inhabitant of the village and a sprinkling of visitors from neighbouring towns. Bunting fluttered from stall to stall. The vicar's wife had arranged the inevitable cake competition with no less zeal than a general marshalling his troops, and a brass band, imported from Marleycombe, blared cheerfully in the background. It was the sort of day when one might have said, indeed many did, that nothing unpleasant could possibly intrude upon such peaceful surroundings. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably on a wooden chair beneath the shade of a linden tree, thought otherwise. Her sharp blue eyes, though softened by the habitual courtesy of her expression, missed very little. She noted, as she sipped weak lemonade, the way Mrs. Calthorpe's hand trembled ever so slightly as she cut slices of sponge cake for eager children. She observed that young Mr. Edmund Blake, handsome, careless, and with a reputation for charm, rather more than industry, appeared to be enjoying a quarrel with a dark-haired girl at the edge of the green. And she reflected, as she so often did, that human nature, whether in a quiet village or a bustling city, seldom altered at its root. The fete proceeded with all the accustomed competitions. Children bobbed for apples, elderly gentlemen tested their strength at a coconut shy, and gossip moved from stall to stall with far greater rapidity than the wares themselves. "It's a splendid turnout," remarked Colonel Denham, who had paused to exchange pleasantries with Miss Marple. "Good to see the village in such fine spirits. Brings one back to the old days." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently, "though I fancy some of us would be happier if the weather were not quite so warm." The colonel dabbed at his forehead with a large handkerchief and chuckled. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. Still, a bit of heat never did anyone real harm." At that very moment a shrill cry pierced the air. Heads turned, conversations broke off, and the brass band stumbled awkwardly to a halt in the middle of Rule Britannia. Near the refreshment tent, a small knot of people gathered, their expressions registering shock and alarm. Miss Marple, her knitting abandoned on her lap, rose with surprising swiftness for one of her years. She threaded her way through the crowd, murmuring polite apologies, until she reached the center of the commotion. There, half sprawled across the trestle table, where teacups had been neatly stacked only minutes before, lay the figure of a man. His face was pale, his eyes wide open yet unseeing, and a dark stain spread across the white linen of his shirt front. "It's Mr. Howard," someone whispered. "Mr. Lionel Howard." Mr. Howard was, not strictly speaking, a villager. He had settled in Willowbrook only 2 years prior, renting the ivy-covered house at the far end of Rose Lane. His manner had been brisk and businesslike, and though he contributed generously to church funds, he was not universally liked. Some thought him too aloof, others muttered darkly about his affairs elsewhere. Yet his sudden collapse shocked even those least fond of him. The vicar pushed forward, his face grave. "Stand back, please. Give him air." But it was evident to Miss Marple, as she looked keenly upon the motionless figure, that air would be of no use. She had seen death before, too often indeed for one who claimed no professional interest in it. The stillness of Mr. Howard's body, the fixity of his gaze, told its own story. "He's dead," said a voice from the crowd, harsh, uncertain, fearful. There was a murmur, half gasp, half protest. The village constable, young Inspector Green, elbowed his way through, his notebook already in hand. He had only lately assumed charge of Willowbrook's modest police station, and his expression betrayed both eagerness and anxiety. "Stand back, all of you," he commanded. "Nobody is to leave the grounds. Not until we know what's happened here." Miss Marple folded her hands before her and said nothing. She listened instead, with that air of mild attention which had so often led people to speak freely in her presence. "Heart attack, most likely," muttered Colonel Denham. "The fellow never looked quite robust." "Nonsense," countered Mrs. Calthorpe, pale and trembling. I saw it. I saw his face. The shock in it. There was something else. What do you mean, something else? Demanded a man at her elbow. But Mrs. Calthorpe had begun to weep quietly into her handkerchief, and offered no further explanation. Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the overturned cup beside Mr. Howard's hand. Tea had spilled across the tablecloth, mingling with the darker stain upon his shirt. She bent slightly, unnoticed in the confusion, and observed a faint but unmistakable odor. Bitter almonds. She straightened, her expression thoughtful. Yes, it would not be heart disease, she feared, and whatever it was, it had been deliberately administered. Voices rose around her, frightened, indignant, curious. Already rumors formed and spread like ripples on a pond. Mr. Howard had enemies. Someone had seen him arguing earlier. There had been whispers of financial impropriety. Miss Marple heard it all, storing each remark with the precision of a mind long trained in the small deceits of human nature. The fete was over. Where there had been merriment, there was now alarm. Where laughter had rung, suspicion crept in its place. Mothers gathered their children, the band packed away their instruments in uneasy silence, and the first murmurs of murder shivered through the summer air. Miss Marple, slipping quietly back to her chair, took up her knitting once more. Her needles clicked softly as she worked, her eyes fixed upon nothing in particular. Yet within her mind threads were already being drawn together. A man dead in broad daylight, in the heart of Willowbrook, amidst tea and cakes and neighborly chatter. And someone among them all, had killed him. Chapter 2. Whispers in Willowbrook. On Sunday morning, Willowbrook dressed itself in sobriety. The bunting had been taken down before dusk, as if color itself had become indecorous, and damp squares on the green marked where trestle tables had stood. Church bells rang more gravely than usual, summoning a congregation uncharacteristically early and attentive. There is nothing like sudden death to put rectitude into a village's gait and a hush into its voice. Miss Marple walked to the service with her neat step, a small prayer book in one gloved hand and her parasol in the other. She paused once by the linden where she had sat the previous afternoon. There, in the grass, a scatter of crushed cake crumbs had attracted an industrious line of ants. She observed them with a mild, abstracted interest, as though they might tell her something. Miss Marple seldom hurried. She liked to let the mind arrange itself, much as one straightens a drawer and discovers at the back a useful object that had been forgotten. The vicar, Reverend Pritchard, spoke feelingly in his sermon on the fragility of life. Mrs. Pritchard dabbed with a lace handkerchief at eyes which, Miss Marple noticed, were dry. The congregation rustled and sighed. Colonel Denham sat bolt upright as if on parade. Mrs. Calthorpe's plump shoulders quivered, and Edmund Blake, handsome and pale, stared at the hymn-board with an expression that suggested calculation more than piety. Afterwards, people lingered in the churchyard beyond any reasonable need to admire the roses that climbed along the stone wall. It is a curious thing about an English village. The closer death comes, the more punctilious become the courtesies. Condolences were murmured into sympathetic air. Conjectures were delivered softly, behind gloved hands. "So very shocking," breathed Mrs. Pritchard to Miss Marple as they stood by the lych gate. "Mr. Howard was not universally beloved, of course, but one cannot help." "Well, it is dreadful to be taken like that. Arthur says the police have been in and out of the vicarage on some nonsense about the loudspeaker. I told them plainly that we had no such equipment." "No?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "But I thought at the fete there was an announcement or two, about the raffle and so forth." Mrs. Pritchard's colour rose. "Only what was spoken on the green, dear Miss Marple. No vulgar apparatus. Mrs. Calthorpe has been in a state ever since and is quite confused. She told Constable, Inspector Green I mean, that she heard a voice from nowhere. Really, one does not need to encourage that sort of silly story." "People often hear what is most useful to hear," said Miss Marple gently, "or what frightens them." She walked on, leaving in her wake a flutter of indignation that would expend itself in new gossip by tea-time. The air smelt of warm stone and clipped yew. Bees droned, and beyond the graves, children's voices shrilled in the lane before being hustled to quietness by mothers who remembered that morning has its forms. The village had, in the manner of villages, settled upon a preliminary explanation by noon. It was whispered at the grocer's, breathed over the counter at the post office, confided in undertones under the elm by the smithy. Mr. Lionel Howard had enemies. He had been a man of business in London. There had been talk of sharp practices. He had come to Willowbrook to escape something, no one could specify what, and had brought with him a tidy sum. No one could specify how much. There had been a quarrel. Oh yes, seen at the very fete, with young Edmund Blake, who never could keep money in his pockets or his temper at heel. From these fragments a complete tale was stitched together and worn by the village with complacency, like a well-fitting coat. Miss Marple did not go directly home. She paid a morning call on Mrs. Calthorpe, whose sponge cake had taken the second prize and whose nerves had taken the worst of the day. The blinds in the sitting-room were half drawn. The smell of lavender water contended, not quite successfully, with the faint sour odor of last night's tea. Mrs. Calthorpe lay on a sofa with a shawl pulled up to her chin, and started up at the sight of Miss Marple as though reprieved. "My dear," said Miss Marple, taking the nearest chair, "you are overwrought. If I may say so, chamomile is less alarming than sal volatile. It does not rush to the head." "I cannot get it out of my mind," wailed Mrs. Calthorpe. "His face, Miss Marple. The way— Oh, I knew it was not a heart attack. There was something else. And the voice. I told the police, but they looked at one another as if I had said a ghost had spoken." "A voice?" Miss Marple arranged her parasol by the chair leg and folded her hands. "Tell me exactly what you heard." "It was very odd." Mrs. Calthorpe shut her eyes. "We were setting out the second lot of cups. The first had all gone almost at once, and Mrs. Pritchard will insist on those tiny ones. I heard the band begin again. Then, as clear as could be, I heard a lady's voice, very refined, not local, say, 'Mr. Howard, Mr. Howard, would you be so kind as to come to the refreshment tent?' Not loud as though calling, but as if it were coming from the air above us. And Mr. Howard came at once. He had been over by the darts, and I saw him start and turn." Miss Marple's head inclined. "You are sure it was not someone near you?" "Quite sure. There was no one with that voice. Then you know he came in and I poured him a cup because he looked rather flushed. He had that manner of his, brisk and impatient, and he took the cup without a word and drank. Oh, Miss Marple." Tears filled Mrs. Calthorpe's eyes. "It was not 5 seconds later." Miss Marple let a little silence gather and settle. "You remember the cup?" "Blue cornflowers round the rim. I must have washed that cup 100 times. It was one of the set we borrowed from Mrs. Hart. Such a dear woman. She scolded me when she heard, as if I had chosen that cup out of spite." "People scold when they are frightened," said Miss Marple. "It gives them a sense of doing something." "The teaspoon?" "The teaspoon." Mrs. Calthorpe stared. "I could not tell you. We had 6 odd ones, put aside for the sugar basin, because the children would run off with them otherwise." "Why?" "No reason in particular," said Miss Marple in the tone that means there is every reason. "You did not notice if Mr. Howard sweetened his tea?" "He did. He always did. 2 lumps. He said once he could not abide it weak and unsweetened, like charwoman's broth." Those were his words. Miss Marple rose presently, soothed the good woman with promises and platitudes, and went on her way. She called briefly at the post office, where Mrs. Larkin, a small brisk person with a beak of a nose, was dealing with a crush of business. The little shop had never been busier. Newspapers, stamps, and information were all in demand. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Larkin with gloomy relish, thumping a packet on the scales. "And make no mistake, there's more to come of it. I said to Mr. Larkin only this morning, 'You mark my words, they'll be clapping irons on someone before the day is out.'" "Oh." Miss Marple's tone was polite. "On whom, Mrs. Larkin?" "Well now," Mrs. Larkin pursed her lips. If you ask me, and mind you I don't say as I've got proof, it will be that Edmund Blake. Insolent as they come, and no better than he should be. I've had him in here more than once with a telegram he didn't care to pay for, and a manner that would sour milk. And he was in a taking with that dark-haired piece yesterday. What's her name? Vera or Iris or something fancy like that. Iris Vale? Miss Marple suggested. The school-teacher who lives in rooms above Mr. Rudge's saddlery. That's the one. Came from Marleycombe Way. Pretty as a picture and twice as useless, if you ask me. She and Mr. Blake were all whispers and hot looks by the hedge. I thought to myself then, no good will come of that. And didn't I say so to Mrs. Webb, Mr. Howard's housekeeper, when she came in for her stamps? No good, I said, and Mrs. Webb agreed there'd been enough goings-on at Rose Lane to keep a body from her proper sleep. What sort of goings-on? Miss Marple asked, as one asks about the weather. Visitors. Late and early, said Mrs. Larkin, lowering her voice. Gentlemen from London, and a woman once, dressed to the nines, and Mrs. Webb said her perfume would have knocked over a horse, and you'll have heard, I dare say, that Mr. Howard had a safe put in. The blacksmith carried it in with 2 men, puffing and swearing. Documents, Mr. Howard told Mrs. Webb, but she said there's documents and documents. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Larkin for her trouble in weighing out the letters, which had not needed weighing at all, and came away with 2 innocent-looking envelopes and 3 separate strands of thought drawing taut in her mind. In the afternoon Inspector Green made his official call at the cottage where Miss Marple was lodging. He was a fair young man with a conscientious manner, and a tendency to look overstretched by the weight of authority. He saluted the elderly lady with a briskness that showed respect for age, and perhaps a memory of having been proved wrong by it before. "I wonder if I might ask you a few questions, Miss Marple," he began, perched carefully on the extreme edge of a chintz-covered chair. "You were close by when Mr. Howard collapsed." "I was near enough," said Miss Marple. "You have learned the cause?" "Dr. Prowse is as certain as a man can be without a full analysis." Inspector Green cleared his throat. "Cyanide. There was a distinct smell. Almonds. You observed it too?" "One could hardly miss it," said Miss Marple. He flushed slightly. "Quite. Now then, there's the matter of how it was administered. We've got the cup. We've got the teapot. We've got the sugar basin. The cup, when it was found, had enough cyanide in the dregs to remove all doubt. The teapot, not a trace. The sugar, 24 lumps left, every one clean as a whistle, which suggests that the poison was already in the cup," said Miss Marple, "or else was added in a form that did not touch the rest of the sugar." She looked at him kindly. "You are thinking of a paper wrapped around a lump?" "We are," he admitted. "And we didn't find any paper, and I've had the ground searched near the tent." "People do like to tidy," Miss Marple murmured. "It is such a comfort to feel one has done something useful at a dreadful moment." She considered. "If the poison was in the cup, you will ask, who poured out for Mr. Howard? Or if the sugar was the vehicle, who handed him the basin or stood by while he sweetened his tea? And there is, too, the question of why Mr. Howard came to that particular place at that particular moment." "Exactly," said Inspector Green rather eagerly. "There are witnesses who say they heard a voice, an announcement, asking Mr. Howard to go to the refreshment tent. But we haven't reconstructed it satisfactorily. Mrs. Pritchard insists there wasn't any sort of amplifier. The bandmaster says he didn't speak between numbers. Yet 6 people will swear they heard a lady calling Mr. Howard to the tent, and none of them can agree on where she was standing." "It is surprising," Miss Marple said, "how sound carries in unexpected ways. When I was a girl, our gardener could call from behind the stable block, and one would have thought he was in the front hall. There are corners in this world that collect voices and send them where they are not expected." He shifted, frowning. "You think someone played a trick with the voice?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone discovered how to summon Mr. Howard without being himself, or herself, remarked. It is a small thing, but small things grow into large ones if fed on time and opportunity." Inspector Green consulted his notebook. "There's another matter. Mr. Howard had a row earlier in the day, seen by several, with Mr. Edmund Blake. Money, by the sound of it. Mr. Blake denies it was anything serious. He admits he owed Mr. Howard £50, Says he was arranging to pay. There's also a report, perhaps you observed, of Mr. Blake standing with Miss Iris Vale in some agitation." "I did observe agitation," said Miss Marple, "and I should not be astonished to learn that Miss Vale is of a romantic disposition. Romantic persons are often impractical in matters of money. Sometimes they are unwise too." Inspector Green smiled briefly. "You don't think romance is the motive here?" "I seldom think romance is the motive people imagine," said Miss Marple. "But jealousy and pride and humiliation, those I have observed to be very potent indeed. As for money, it is more common than roses at a village fête." He closed his notebook with a small snap. "We'll be taking formal statements, and if you notice anything, Miss Marple, anything at all, you'll tell me." "Of course," she said. "One must help in any way one can." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting. She did 3 neat rows before setting it aside. Outside, the lane ran green and quiet toward Rose Lane, where Mr. Howard had kept his tidy, ivy-hung house. Tidy, Miss Marple thought, but not tranquil. Visitors late and early, a safe installed, a housekeeper observant and alarmed, a young man in debt, a pretty schoolteacher too ready with her feelings. This was not yet a pattern, but it contained threads. Just before tea there was the click of the garden gate and a light tap at the door. Miss Iris Vale came in at Miss Marple's invitation, fresh-faced, dark-eyed, and with that very prettiness which had set the village tongues wagging. She did not sit at once. She looked about as if the little parlor might give her courage. "I hope I am not intruding," she said in a low voice. I thought you might. I didn't know who else to speak to." "Sit down, my dear," said Miss Marple, and Iris obeyed like a child. "A cup of tea?" At that, the girl shuddered. "No, not tea. Not today." She pressed her hands together. "I wanted to say that Edmund, Mr. Blake, did not do this. He can be foolish, I know he can, and say horrid things he doesn't mean. But he is not wicked." "Few people are wicked," said Miss Marple comfortably, "though a number are foolish and some are cruel. Tell me, Miss Vale, why were you and Mr. Blake in agitation yesterday?" "We had quarrelled," Iris said simply. "About Mr. Howard, about money. Edmund. Oh, I hate speaking so, but you must know. Edmund had borrowed from him, and Mr. Howard made it ugly." She swallowed. "He said things to Edmund that were unpardonable. About Edmund's father, who was clerk to Mr. Howard's firm in London once, before they came down. And about me. Mr. Howard had no right." Miss Marple observed the quick flush. "About you?" "He said I had put Edmund up to it, that I had expensive tastes." Iris's dark eyes brimmed. "It isn't true. I have a little from my aunt and my salary. I have never asked Edmund for anything." She looked up desperately. "You must believe me. And Edmund, he said he would tell Mr. Howard to keep his money and his insults. He said he would not be beholden. That is all we argued about." "All?" Miss Marple repeated, and the word had a gentleness that made it no less searching. Iris hesitated. "There is one thing more," she whispered. "Yesterday evening, just before it happened, I heard it too. That voice. I was by the bookstall, and I heard as plain as if she were beside me. Mr. Howard, would you be so kind as to come to the refreshment tent?" It was like a voice on the wireless, you know, only without the crackle. And I thought, how odd, because I had seen Mrs. Pritchard with a bell earlier, and I did not think they had got a loudspeaker. And when I turned, there wasn't any person near with a voice like that. Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, my dear. It is useful to know that more than one person heard the same thing, and in the same way. One cannot argue with a single witness except to doubt her nerves. Multiple witnesses now. That suggests a method rather than an accident." "A method?" Iris whispered. "A method for a summons," said Miss Marple matter-of-factly. "You see, people leave themselves unguarded when something appears ordinary. One expects the vicar's wife to send for a gentleman to help with a basket, or to make an announcement. One does not question a polite request heard by many. I dare say Mr. Howard came as bidden and took the nearest cup to be polite as well. Politeness, Miss Vale, is a terrible accomplice to crime." When Iris had gone, the shadows were lengthening. Miss Marple took a slow turn in the small garden. She paused by the hedge and considered the green, a voice that came from nowhere, and yet came to many ears at once. There are tricks with mirrors and tricks with strings, she reflected, and there are tricks with voices. The brass band had its instruments and music stands. The church had its bell. The village had, tucked away and ready for fêtes and auctions, a handbell and a megaphone once used for a wartime drill. Miss Marple had seen it hanging in the vicarage storeroom in past years. If it was gone, who had borrowed it? Her thoughts moved, not hurriedly but with persistence, over small details. A blue cornflower cup, 2 lumps of sugar, a missing or unremarked teaspoon, a safe carried into a house on Rose Lane, an insult that touched a young man's pride, a woman's voice heard by many and owned by none. At dusk, the peace of the lane was broken by quick footsteps. Edmund Blake strode past the garden gate, hatless, head down. He did not see Miss Marple among the roses. She watched him go on, shoulders stiff, down toward Rose Lane, and thought not unkindly that young men will walk into storms rather than around them if they think honor is at stake. A dangerous age, honor. It makes bad company for prudence. Later still, as the first stars pricked out timidly in a sky not yet decided upon night, a second ripple of gossip spread, like the widening rings after a thrown stone. Mrs. Webb had been to Marleycombe to telephone Mr. Howard's solicitor. There were papers to be looked to, she said, and had come back in a state. She had found, so Mrs. Larkin reported, and if Mrs. Larkin reported it, the village believed it, that the safe at Rose Lane was locked as usual, but the drawer where Mr. Howard kept his keys was empty, and in its place, a thing of no value, merely a glass paperweight shaped like a sleeping cat. Only fancy, Mrs. Larkin declared to the last customer before shuttering up for the night. There's a meaning to that, you take it from me. Cats go sneaking after things, and keys don't walk out by themselves. Miss Marple, in her room, folded her nightdress precisely under the pillow. She recalled a boy in her village long ago who had hidden his ill-gotten sweets in a teapot because he thought no one would look for them in such an obvious place. People do much the same with their wickedness, she reflected. They put it where kindness will not immediately suspect. In a cup of tea, perhaps. In a voice that sounds like help. In a paperweight no one would pocket. She turned down the lamp. The house settled and creaked. Somewhere far off a dog barked twice and then held its peace. Tomorrow would bring statements and searches and, very likely, an arrest that would satisfy the village for a time. But Miss Marple, who knew something of the stubborn habits of truth, also knew that the first person to wear the village's neatly stitched coat rarely deserved it. She smiled slightly in the dark, not with pleasure but with recognition. There were threads to be followed yet. Chapter 3. The Wrong Suspect. By Monday morning, Willowbrook was awash with certainty. The police had not yet issued any official statement, but the village had already tried and convicted Edmund Blake in the court of whisper and nod. He was seen striding down Rose Lane late the previous evening. Mrs. Webb herself had sworn to it, and the implication was clear enough. Young men with debts and tempers were easily believed capable of desperate deeds. Miss Marple, coming back from the baker's with a small loaf and a paper of currant buns, overheard Mrs. Larkin pronouncing judgment from her post-office counter. "Mark my words," she said to an eager little audience. "It'll be Mr. Blake in the dock before the week is out. A bad egg, and always was. I said so the first time he slammed a telegram receipt down without so much as a thank you." Her listeners nodded gravely, as if rudeness with telegrams were the first step upon the road to murder. Miss Marple, who had an excellent memory for village history, recalled that quite a different culprit had once been confidently identified on the strength of a slammed door. The poor girl in that case had been entirely innocent, though she had run off with a commercial traveller a year later, which most people said amounted to much the same thing. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, is never at a loss for explanations once its mind is made up. She carried her loaf home in tranquil silence, but her eyes as ever were alert. She noticed Edmund Blake himself passing the smithy, pale, hollow-eyed, but with his head held defiantly high. He lifted his hat to her with a stiff courtesy that carried more pride than politeness. Miss Marple inclined her head gently in return. That afternoon Inspector Green came again, this time with a purposeful air that spoke of decisions already formed. He sat at Miss Marple's little parlour table, his notebook at the ready, and spoke with the briskness of a man who wished to confirm what he already knew. "We've taken young Blake into custody for questioning," he announced. "There's a good deal of evidence against him." Miss Marple's expression was politely attentive. "Indeed?" "In the first place, the quarrel on the green. Several witnesses heard harsh words about money. In the second, his movements. He admits to going down Rose Lane late last night, though he won't say what business he had there. And in the third," Inspector Green consulted his notes with satisfaction, "we've found that Mr. Howard had drawn up a paper demanding repayment of £50, due at once, and threatening court proceedings. That paper was still in his desk." "And the keys?" Miss Marple inquired. Green colored slightly. "Yes, the keys to Mr. Howard's safe are missing, but it's possible Mr. Howard had them on his person. We're still searching." Miss Marple smoothed the folds of her skirt. "And young Mr. Blake's explanation?" "He insists he had no hand in Mr. Howard's death. Says he argued, yes, but he meant to pay, and he would never resort to poison. But his manner, well, Miss Marple, you've seen it yourself. Defiant, sullen, won't give a straight answer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled almost imperceptibly. "When I was a girl, Inspector, I remember a boy accused of stealing apples. He denied it with such heat and temper that everyone thought him guilty, until his little sister admitted she had taken them. Some young men, I think, would rather be thought wicked than weak. Pride is very difficult at that age." Inspector Green looked doubtful. "Even so, there's the means and the motive. Poison in a teacup doesn't fall from the sky." "Poison," said Miss Marple, "is not a young man's method. It is slow, secret, and cowardly. Young men, when they strike, usually strike hard and openly. They do not wait for almonds to do their work." The inspector blinked. "You think—" "I think," Miss Marple said mildly, "that you will find your case against Mr. Blake does not quite fit, and cases that do not fit are seldom true." That evening the talk in every cottage, on every garden path, was of Edmund Blake's guilt. Mrs. Pritchard told her circle that she had always had a poor opinion of the young man, though she had said nothing at the time. Colonel Denham shook his head gravely and pronounced it a bad business, though he remembered Blake's father as a sound fellow, a bit hot-tempered. And Mrs. Calthorpe, who still shivered at the memory of the voice from nowhere, declared that she had noticed an odd light in Edmund's eyes all day at the fete, though I did not like to mention it. Amid this chorus of certainty, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting and thought of three things. She thought of the paperweight shaped like a sleeping cat, left in place of keys. She thought of a polite, feminine voice heard by many, though owned by none. And she thought of Mrs. Calthorpe's trembling insistence on the blue cornflower cup. The village had chosen its culprit, as villages always do. But Miss Marple knew that the truth is not chosen. It is uncovered, and it seldom lies where everyone is pointing. Chapter 4. Secrets Revealed. By Tuesday, the arrest of Edmund Blake had given Willowbrook a false air of calm. Villagers went about their business with the subdued propriety of those who feel justice is already on its way. Yet beneath the calm little eddies of speculation swirled, gathering strength. Miss Marple, however, was not lulled. She had seen before how swiftly suspicion could attach itself to the convenient, while the inconvenient truth slipped quietly by. Her mind returned, as it had all day, to that curious substitution in Mr. Howard's desk. The missing keys and the glass paperweight shaped like a sleeping cat. Such a gesture bespoke calculation, and perhaps mockery. Murder was sometimes committed in heat, but theft and substitution required a colder hand. That morning, Miss Marple paid a call upon Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper at Rose Lane. The ivy-hung house stood prim and shuttered, its front steps scrubbed to a weary whiteness. Mrs. Webb, a tall woman with sharp features and the air of one accustomed to taking care of things without help, admitted Miss Marple with an eagerness that suggested she, too, had been waiting for someone to listen. "Dreadful, ma'am, dreadful," Mrs. Webb began at once, ushering her guest into the sitting-room where the curtains were half drawn. "I said to myself only last week, something will come of all this, and sure enough it has. The late hours, the callers from London, the safe brought in like a coffin, and Mr. Howard himself, restless and short-tempered. Never a night these past months without my hearing his step up and down the study." "Callers from London?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "Yes, ma'am. Once a fortnight at least. Gentlemen in motor cars. And once a lady, fine as you please in furs though the day was mild. The whole house reeked of her scent for hours after. I thought to myself, no good will come of this. Mr. Howard wasn't the sort to entertain for amusement, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple did. She had encountered more than one gentleman who had left the city under a cloud, bringing with him both wealth and enemies. "And the safe?" she asked. Mrs. Webb sniffed. "Documents," he said. "But I know the feel of a cash box when I dust round it. He kept it locked, and the keys always in the top right drawer of his desk, until the night before last, when I looked, and there was that ridiculous glass cat instead. I near dropped it out of fright, as if someone were laughing." Miss Marple regarded her hostess thoughtfully. "Had Mr. Howard enemies here in Willowbrook, do you think?" "Not friends, anyway," Mrs. Webb said grimly. "He lent money, if you want the truth. I kept his accounts after a fashion. He had me carry messages and once or twice write down figures he dictated. There were names I recognized, ma'am, village names, and the sums weren't trifling." Miss Marple nodded. Money-lending, especially of the private, sharp-elbowed kind, was an occupation that bred resentments faster than weeds in a garden. She thanked Mrs. Webb and took her leave, walking slowly back through the lane, her mind filled with the housekeeper's revelations. Money, visitors from London, a lady in furs, a missing key, a mocking paperweight. The picture grew darker, but not clearer. That afternoon the Pritchards held a gathering in the vicarage garden. A small, informal tea, as Mrs. Pritchard described it, though it had all the flavour of a council of war. Colonel Denham was there, his moustache bristling with indignation at the state of things. Mrs. Calthorpe nervously sipping her tea, young Iris Vale pale but composed, and Miss Marple knitting serenely in the shade. The conversation inevitably turned to Edmund Blake. "It is a disgrace," Mrs. Pritchard declared, "that a young man of this village should so far forget himself as to quarrel publicly, and then, well, I shall not say the word in front of the servants." "I do not like it," said Colonel Denham. "Poison, you know, not an Englishman's weapon. Dash it all, if you've got a quarrel, you settle it with your fists." "Precisely," murmured Miss Marple, her needles clicking. But Mrs. Calthorpe leaned forward, her voice low and trembling. "There is more, I think. Mrs. Webb told me, I should not repeat it, but I must, that Mr. Howard kept sums of money in the house, and people knew it. More than one might have wanted him gone." At this Iris Vale spoke for the first time. Her dark eyes flashed. "Edmund is innocent," she said with quiet force. "He may have owed Mr. Howard money, yes, but he is not a coward, and he is not a murderer." Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "My dear, we all understand your attachment, but one cannot blind oneself to facts." Miss Marple glanced at the girl kindly. "Facts are often like knitting stitches, my dear. Drop one and the whole pattern looks wrong. Find it again and everything fits." At that moment the maid appeared with a message. Inspector Green requested to see Miss Marple at once. She found him waiting in the vicarage study, papers spread before him. His face was drawn, but determined. "There's something new," he said without preamble. "We've traced Mr. Howard's visitors. One of them was a man named Partridge, dismissed from his firm in London under suspicion of fraud. Another was a woman calling herself Mrs. Delaney, though her real name is Margaret Drew. She was Howard's secretary once. Both have records, not serious crimes, but dubious behavior, and both were seen in Marleycombe within the past week. Miss Marple inclined her head. And the money lending? Inspector Green's jaw tightened. We've confirmed it. Several villagers borrowed from him. Colonel Denham, for one, to keep his nephew afloat in a motor business. Mrs. Calthorpe's son, to cover a speculation that failed. Even Mrs. Pritchard, though she denies it hotly. All small amounts compared to London standards, but large enough here, and every one of them overdue. Dear me, said Miss Marple softly. That does complicate matters. The inspector rubbed his brow. It gives us a dozen motives instead of one, and yet, his eyes hardened. The quarrel with Blake, the debt, the defiance. It all points to him. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet compassion. Sometimes, Inspector, the obvious thread is not the strongest, and sometimes the pattern is designed to mislead. As she left the study, she reflected that the truth was moving, slowly but surely, into the open. Behind the respectable facades of Willowbrook, she saw now a web of debts, secrets, and resentments. Everyone had something to hide, everyone, perhaps, something to lose. But who among them all had the will and the cunning to kill? Chapter 5. The Second Incident. Wednesday dawned with a pale, uneasy sun, as though the sky itself sensed the disquiet that hung over Willowbrook. The village went about its business more briskly than usual, but there was a tautness in the air. Shop bells jingled too sharply, doors shut with a snap, and conversations broke off when footsteps approached. Miss Marple, walking into the high street to post a letter, felt it keenly. It was the same atmosphere she remembered from her own village of St. Mary Mead on the morning after a scandal had broken. Half dread, half relish. Human nature, she reflected, could not help but be fascinated by its own darker possibilities. At the post office, Mrs. Larkin was bursting with the latest intelligence. They say Edmund Blake will be charged within the day, she confided, her nose sharp with excitement. Inspector Green has had him under guard since Monday, and Mrs. Webb told Mrs. Calthorpe that they found one of Mr. Howard's checkbooks torn up in the lane. What more do you need? Miss Marple paid for her stamps, and made no reply. She had learned long ago that people seldom welcome contradiction when they are enjoying their certainty. That afternoon, however, certainty was shaken. It happened at the vicarage, of all places. Mrs. Pritchard had organized a ladies' sewing circle, partly to keep minds occupied and partly to ensure that gossip remained in her keeping rather than drifting into Mrs. Larkin's hands. Miss Marple, though not inclined to busy herself with patchwork, had accepted the invitation. She found such gatherings instructive. The women sat in a circle beneath the tall window of the drawing-room, needles flashing, tongues fluttering. Mrs. Calthorpe, pale but eager, recounted for the fourth time the voice she had heard. Miss Denham spoke of her uncle's anxieties. Iris Vale stitched silently, her eyes shadowed. It was all very ordinary until the shriek came. Mrs. Pritchard's maid had entered with a fresh pot of tea, and as she set it on the side table, gave a cry so sharp that every stitch and whisper stopped. There it is again, she cried, pointing with a trembling hand. The ladies turned as one. From the corner of the room, an empty corner, bare save for a fern on a stand, a voice had spoken, clear, feminine, refined, and unmistakable. Would you be so kind as to come to the study? It said. The words hung in the air, distinct and undeniable. A silence followed, filled only by the sound of the fern's fronds trembling as though in a draught. Mrs. Pritchard turned ashen. Arthur, she gasped, though the vicar was nowhere near. Mrs. Calthorpe dropped her sewing altogether and clutched Miss Marple's arm. It's the voice, the very same voice, she whispered. But Miss Marple, though startled, did not clutch. She rose, walked with her quiet tread to the corner, and bent. Behind the fern, half concealed by its green leaves, was a small wooden box with a hinged lid and a coil of wire trailing from it. A wireless speaker, she said gently, lifting it into view. quite portable, and very cleverly placed. The women gasped in chorus. Inspector Green was summoned at once and came bustling in with a constable. He examined the device with grim satisfaction. "There we are," he declared. "Proof of trickery. Someone lured Howard to his death with this contraption." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "and someone has now wished us all to know it." Inspector Green frowned. "You mean whoever did it planted this here on purpose? To be found?" "Of course," said Miss Marple, settling herself serenely back into her chair. "Criminals are sometimes like children with a secret. They cannot resist showing off their cleverness, though they think it hidden. A voice that comes from nowhere can be most convincing, and most dangerous." The inspector looked at her sharply, but Miss Marple only took up her knitting. Her needles clicked softly, an oddly comforting sound in the shaken room. That evening news of the discovery spread through Willowbrook like fire in dry grass. Some said it proved Edmund Blake's guilt beyond doubt. After all, who but a young man would think of using modern wireless tricks? Others insisted it pointed elsewhere, for surely Edmund had neither the brains nor the equipment for such ingenuity. As for Miss Marple, she sat by her lamp knitting in even rows and reflected. A wireless speaker in the vicarage meant planning. It meant someone had access to the vicar's storeroom, where she remembered having once seen a megaphone and other wartime relics. It meant, too, that the crime had not been a sudden impulse, but carefully prepared. And now, with the device revealed, it meant that the killer was no longer content with silence. He, or she, was playing a game. Chapter 6. Beneath the Surface. The discovery of the wireless speaker at the vicarage threw Willowbrook into a new state of agitation. For a village so accustomed to the rhythm of bells, gossip, and market days, the idea of invisible voices speaking through hidden machines carried an air of sorcery. Children whispered of ghosts. Their mothers shushed them sternly, though not without a nervous glance over their shoulders. Inspector Green, now much in evidence about the lanes, declared that the device was conclusive evidence of a deliberate hoax. But his conviction did little to ease the villagers, for if Howard had been summoned to his death by a trick, then the murderer must be cleverer than most of them had suspected, and more calculating. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her garden with a pot of tea, received a succession of callers that day, each bearing a different anxiety thinly disguised as neighborly courtesy. Mrs. Calthorpe was the first. She came bustling through the gate with her parasol flapping like a banner of distress. "My dear Miss Marple, it is beyond bearing. To think I heard it, and now it turns out to be a contrivance. I declare I shall never trust my ears again. And my poor son, why, if people learn he borrowed from Howard, they will think, well, you know what they will think." Miss Marple poured tea and murmured her sympathy. In her experience, people seldom confessed their own secrets outright unless they feared someone else might reveal them first. Mrs. Calthorpe leaned forward, her voice dropping. "It was only £50, you understand, and for such a promising scheme. Motor bicycles, of all things. But Mr. Howard would have his interest, and when my son could not meet the payment, oh, the things he said to me, Miss Marple. To a mother. I told him I should never forgive, and now he is dead. People will put it together in the most dreadful way." Miss Marple soothed her gently, though her mind ticked steadily onward. Another debtor, then. Another motive. Next came Colonel Denham, striding up the path with the energy of one who wished to demonstrate his clear conscience. "Confounded business, Miss Marple. I tell you plainly, Howard had no right to press me as he did. I borrowed a trifling sum for my nephew's garage, yes, but a gentleman ought to know when to give another gentleman time. Instead, he threatened legal action. Perfectly beastly." Miss Marple's eyes were very mild. "And yet, Colonel, you did not strike him." The Colonel reddened. "Certainly not. Dash it all, I may have lost my temper, but poison? Never. If I'd meant to finish Howard, I'd have done it man to man." "I quite believe you," said Miss Marple soothingly. "Poison is rarely chosen by gentlemen of your temperament." When the Colonel departed, looking both indignant and oddly relieved, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. Another debtor, another protestation of innocence. By evening a third caller appeared. Not at Miss Marple's gate this time, but at her window. Iris Vale, pale and tremulous, stood among the roses like a ghost. "May I come in?" she asked softly. Miss Marple nodded, and the girl slipped inside. She clasped her hands tightly, as if to keep them still. "I must tell someone," Iris whispered. "It is true. Edmund owes money, but so do others. Colonel Denham, Mrs. Calthorpe, even Mrs. Pritchard, and Mr. Howard. He was cruel about it. He taunted Edmund before others. But there was more. He said things about me. He threatened to tell something." Miss Marple's knitting paused for a moment. "And what was that, my dear?" The girl flushed scarlet. "That I had once been employed in Marleycombe, at a shop. That I had been friendly with a man there who later got into trouble. It was foolish, perhaps, but not wicked. Yet Howard made it sound shameful. He said he would ruin me with gossip if Edmund did not pay." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with tranquil fingers. "Blackmail, then. It is a very old and very ugly game." Iris's eyes filled with tears. "Do you see, Miss Marple? Edmund had to quarrel with him, but he did not kill him. He did not." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I quite believe Edmund is not the sort for poison. But blackmail, debts, cruelty, these are fertile soils, and one cannot always tell which seed will sprout first." After the girl had gone, the cottage grew quiet again. Outside the twilight deepened, and a thrush sang its evening song. Miss Marple sat with her knitting and thought. The pattern was spreading, stitch by stitch, debts unpaid, secrets threatened, reputations at stake. Nearly everyone in Willowbrook had reason to wish Mr. Howard gone, but it was not the reasons that most occupied her mind. It was the method, a polite disembodied voice, a cup of tea, a paperweight shaped like a sleeping cat. Someone, she reflected, had woven together cruelty, cunning, and mockery, and hidden it beneath the pleasant chatter of an English village, and until the truth came out, the surface of Willowbrook would remain very far from calm. Chapter 7. A Warning in the Dark. Thursday evening brought a change in the weather. Clouds gathered low and heavy, pressing upon the little village as though the sky itself wished to keep secrets close. By dusk, a fine mist crept over the lanes, softening hedgerows and blurring the outline of the church tower. Miss Marple, who had spent much of the day in her garden trimming spent roses, went indoors early. She was not a nervous woman, but she recognized the signs of a village too tightly wound. Fear, once stirred, can be as dangerous as anger, and often more silent. After supper, as she set her knitting aside, there came a tap at her window. Not the anxious flutter of a caller like Iris Vale, but a sharp, deliberate rapping. She rose at once, drew back the curtain, and saw no one. Only the mist in the lane, shifting faintly like breath on glass. When she opened the window, however, a small square envelope fell to the sill. It was of cheap paper, unaddressed, and inside was a single sheet bearing 5 words, neatly printed in block capitals. "Keep quiet, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple read it twice, then laid it calmly upon the table. Her face did not alter, though her eyes sharpened. Such notes, she knew, were meant less to silence than to frighten, and fear was a most useful weapon in the hands of the wicked. She made herself a cup of cocoa, drank it thoughtfully, and retired to bed. But she did not sleep at once. In her mind she reviewed the curious pattern. Debts unpaid, blackmail hinted, visitors from London, and a wireless speaker hidden behind a fern. Now a crude little threat slipped through mist and darkness. "Too clumsy," she murmured to herself in the dark. "Much too clumsy for the hand that placed the paperweight." The next morning the village awoke to fresh agitation. Edmund Blake, released under caution for want of evidence, had gone missing from his mother's house. His bed had not been slept in, and his boots were gone. "He's fled, of course," declared Mrs. Larkin with relish. "Clear proof of guilt." But Miss Marple, when she heard the news, only shook her head. "Young men run away from shame, Mrs. Larkin, sometimes even from love, but seldom from crime." Inspector Green was less sanguine. He appeared at Miss Marple's cottage with lines of worry deepening his youthful brow. "This complicates things, Miss Marple. Blake gone missing. It looks bad." "It looks," Miss Marple said mildly, "like a young man in fear of being made a scapegoat. Tell me, Inspector, what of the keys?" "Still missing." He rubbed his forehead. "And we've learned more about Howard's safe. Webb says she saw notes in it. Banknotes, a considerable sum. But when we forced it open yesterday, there was nothing inside. Empty, except for a sheaf of old receipts." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Then the theft was cleverer than the murder. That is often the way." The inspector frowned. "You think robbery was the motive, then?" "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "robbery may be a motive, but people rarely kill for money alone. They kill for fear, for rage, for humiliation. The money, that will have gone as neatly as the paperweight was left." That afternoon, while the village busied itself with theories of Edmund Blake's flight, Miss Marple took a quiet walk along Rose Lane. The ivy on Howard's empty house hung heavy with moisture. The gate creaked as she leaned upon it. She stood for several minutes gazing at the silent windows and thought of the men from London, the lady in furs, the debts, and the secrets Howard had collected. As she turned away, she caught the faintest sound in the mist, the crunch of a footstep retreating quickly into the hedgerow. She did not follow. She only smiled, very slightly, and murmured to herself, "Yes, the net is drawing tighter, and someone does not like it." That night, while the villagers locked their doors early and whispered about Edmund's disappearance, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and began to make a list, not of names, but of qualities. Pride, fear, greed, cruelty, the very threads from which crimes are always woven. And somewhere, hidden in those threads, was the hand that had set a voice to speak from nowhere, and then sent a warning into the dark. Chapter 8. The Return of Edmund Blake. It was Saturday morning when the matter of Edmund Blake resolved itself, though not in the manner the village had expected. For 2 days tongues had wagged freely, confident that the young man had fled in guilt. Mrs. Larkin declared she would not be surprised if he turned up in Dover, boarding a boat to France. Colonel Denham shook his head, pronouncing that Blake had disgraced his father's name. Mrs. Pritchard spoke of the moral decline of youth. And then, quite suddenly, Edmund walked back into Willowbrook. Miss Marple was in her garden dead-heading roses when she saw him pass by the gate. He was unshaven, his clothes travel-stained, but his step was determined and his chin high. He looked less like a fugitive than a young man who had walked many miles with his thoughts for company. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," Miss Marple called softly over the hedge. He started, then gave her a wry smile. "Miss Marple, I expect the whole village thinks me a scoundrel." "They think what it is easiest to think," Miss Marple replied. "Where have you been?" "London," he said shortly. Then, after a pause, "I went to see someone who knew Howard. I wanted answers." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And did you find them?" He hesitated. "Not the answers I wanted. Only more questions. Howard wasn't just lending money here. He was mixed up with men in the city. Bad men. I was warned to keep clear. One of them hinted Howard had a hold over me, and over others too. He said if Howard were dead it wouldn't surprise many." Miss Marple studied him. He looked tired, but there was no guilt in his voice, only frustration. "You must tell Inspector Green," she said gently. "Even if he does not believe you, the truth must be spoken somewhere." Edmund gave a humorless laugh. "Inspector Green believes I poisoned Howard. He'll take anything I say as excuse." Miss Marple laid down her secateurs. "Then perhaps, my dear boy, you should tell me everything instead." He did. They sat together on the garden bench while he poured out his story, the debt of £50, Howard's sneers about his father, Howard's threats to ruin Iris Vale's reputation. Edmund admitted he had lost his temper on the green that day, but swore he had not gone near the refreshment tent. "And the night you disappeared?" Miss Marple asked. "I went to Marleycombe, caught the late train to London. I spoke with a man named Partridge. one of Howard's old associates. He said Howard kept a ledger, recording every debt and every secret. If that ledger exists, it's worth more than money. But he wouldn't say where it was, only hinted it wasn't in the safe. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had brought to the bench, clicked steadily. A ledger? Yes. That would be most inconvenient for certain people. At that moment, Inspector Green himself arrived, striding briskly up the lane. He stopped dead at the sight of Edmund. "You, back at last," he snapped. "Do you know half the county's been searching for you?" "I know," Edmund said wearily. "But I'm here now, and I've something you ought to hear." They went inside, and over tea, which Edmund refused with a grimace at the very word, he repeated his tale. Inspector Green listened, frowning. "It may be true," he said at last, "but it doesn't alter the fact that you quarreled with Howard, owed him money, and were seen skulking in Rose Lane the night of his death." "I wasn't skulking," Edmund burst out. "I went to confront him, yes, but when I got there the house was dark. I never even knocked." "Convenient?" said the inspector dryly. Miss Marple spoke then, her tone mild. "Perhaps not so convenient as you think, Inspector. If Mr. Blake had wished to rob Howard's safe, why leave the paperweight in so deliberate a fashion? And if he had wished to silence Howard, why use poison, which requires forethought, opportunity, and access to the tea things? That is not the impatience of youth. It is the calculation of someone far cooler." Inspector Green looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple's calm assurance seemed to steady Edmund. He sat a little straighter, though his hands clenched at his knees. When the inspector left, Miss Marple turned to the young man. "You must not despair, Mr. Blake. Truth has a way of emerging, though sometimes it needs a little help." Edmund gave her a searching look. "Do you believe me, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "I believe you are hot-tempered, proud, and foolish, but no murderer." That evening news of Edmund's return spread like wildfire. Half the village declared it proved his innocence, for what guilty man would come back? The other half insisted it showed arrogance, the shamelessness of youth. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, thought not of the gossip. She thought of the missing ledger, of the too clever voice that had summoned Howard, of the safe emptied before anyone could open it, and she thought too of the little note slipped to her in the mist. "Keep quiet or you'll regret it." Whoever had written those words was watching still, and sooner or later they would act again. Chapter 9. Miss Marple Sets a Snare. Sunday was a day of deceptive calm in Willowbrook. The church bells rang, the choir sang, and the congregation murmured prayers with an air of extra piety, as though heaven itself might be persuaded to overlook the village's current troubles. But beneath the hymn books and bowed heads, suspicion smouldered. Edmund Blake's reappearance had unsettled the neat conviction of guilt, and once certainty is disturbed, it seldom rests quietly. Miss Marple attended the service with her usual modesty. She noted the furtive glances cast toward Edmund and Iris Vale, who sat stiffly together in the second pew. She observed Colonel Denham fidgeting with his gloves, his eyes never straying far from Mrs. Calthorpe, who for her part seemed intent on whispering to Mrs. Pritchard. Afterwards, in the churchyard, the murmurs rose again. But Miss Marple did not linger. She walked home slowly, her mind arranging thoughts like stitches upon her needles. That afternoon she received Inspector Green. He looked tired, as though 2 sleepless nights had pressed upon him the burden of authority he was still young enough to resent. "It's no use, Miss Marple," he confessed. "Everyone had reason to dislike Howard, and half the village owed him money. But opportunity? That's harder to pin down. The poison was in the cup. We're certain of that. But which hand set it there?" Miss Marple folded her hands upon her lap. "Perhaps, Inspector, the question is not who could, but who would. Poison requires patience. It requires a mind not inflamed by sudden temper, but cool enough to prepare." Green frowned. "You've someone in mind?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have several, but I think it is time we let the murderer tell us himself." And so she explained, quietly, almost apologetically, the outline of a little experiment she proposed. The inspector, doubtful at first, found himself nodding despite his reservations. The very next evening, at Miss Marple's suggestion, the principal villagers were invited to the vicarage under the pretext of clarifying statements. Mrs. Pritchard was more than willing to host, particularly when assured it would be a respectable gathering with tea and cakes provided. Colonel Denham arrived punctually, bristling with indignation at the implied suspicion. Mrs. Calthorpe fluttered in, already trembling at the thought of further questioning. Iris Vale came with Edmund, who looked sullen but determined. Even Mrs. Webb was summoned from Rose Lane, stiff in her black dress, her lips thin with disapproval. Miss Marple was there too, seated unobtrusively with her knitting. The vicar fussed with chairs, Inspector Green cleared his throat, and Mrs. Pritchard presided from the tea-tray like a general over her troops. The evening began quietly enough, with Inspector Green repeating certain questions about the fete. Who had stood where? Who had poured tea? Who had seen Mr. Howard in the minutes before his death? The answers, already given before, sounded more frayed now, the words worn thin by repetition. Then Miss Marple looked up from her knitting and spoke. "Do you know," she said in her mild voice, "I believe we might make the matter clearer if we were to do something very simple. If we were to imagine, just for a moment, that Mr. Howard is among us again. If we were to call him, as he was called that day." There was a little stir at this. Mrs. Calthorpe gasped. "The voice." Colonel Denham frowned. Edmund shifted uneasily. "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly. "The voice that spoke from nowhere. If one of us were to repeat those very words, here now, I think we might learn something useful." Inspector Green looked startled, but Miss Marple's expression was so serenely innocent that he found himself nodding. "Very well. Who will volunteer?" For a moment no one moved. Then Mrs. Pritchard, perhaps seeking to assert her authority, said briskly, "I will, of course." She stood, smoothed her skirt, and called clearly, "Mr. Howard, would you be so kind as to come to the refreshment tent?" Her voice rang out, but it was unmistakably hers, familiar, local, nothing ghostly in it. One by one the others were pressed into service. Mrs. Calthorpe's trembling tones faltered. Colonel Denham growled it like an order. Iris Vale spoke softly, her voice too youthful. Edmund muttered it with sullen impatience. Mrs. Webb, thin-lipped, delivered it sharply like a command to a servant. Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Yes," she murmured. "Quite as I thought." Inspector Green looked at her, puzzled. "Well, what do you mean?" But Miss Marple only smiled and bent once more over her knitting. For she had heard in that little parlour what she had wanted to hear, not the words themselves, but the echoes in the faces around her. A flicker of fear, a glance too quickly suppressed, a momentary tightening of lips. The voice at the fete had been borrowed, imitated, perhaps even recorded, but the guilt in a face cannot be so easily hidden. The trap had been set, and now Miss Marple knew it was only a matter of waiting for it to close. Chapter 10. The Ledger. Monday morning brought rain, a steady downpour that drummed upon cottage roofs and turned the village lanes to mud. Willowbrook, subdued by the weather, seemed almost relieved. Rain muffled gossip, kept neighbours indoors, and gave an air of decency to silence. But not for long. By mid-morning a rumour spread like a drop stitch racing through knitting. Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper at Rose Lane, had discovered something. By the time Inspector Green reached the ivy-hung house, half the village already knew that Mr. Howard's missing ledger, the mysterious book whispered of by his London associates, had been found. Miss Marple, too, heard the news and walked with deliberate calm to Rose Lane, where the inspector was already examining the discovery. The ledger lay upon Howard's desk, its cover worn, its pages filled with neat, crabbed handwriting. The entries were chilling in their precision. Names, dates, sums of money, and, most damning, little notes of leverage. A debt here, a foolish indiscretion there, an unwise letter or promise. Howard had recorded everything, not only in Willowbrook but in London too. Inspector Green turned the pages with a grim face. So it's true. He was a blackmailer as well as a moneylender. Mrs. Webb sniffed. I said all along there was wickedness in this house. Found it myself, I did. Tucked in the false bottom of that drawer. It wasn't there when I looked before. Someone's been and put it back. Back? Green repeated sharply. Yes, Inspector, back. Mrs. Webb's bony hands twisted together. I tell you, I searched that desk after Mr. Howard died. Everyone was saying the keys were missing, and I thought perhaps, well, I looked. There was no ledger then. Someone must have had it all this time and returned it now, bold as brass. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the book. Returned, or planted, Mrs. Webb. Sometimes things appear just where they will cause the greatest stir. The inspector scowled. You think this is a trick? I think, Miss Marple said mildly, that truth seldom lies in the place it is most conveniently found. The ledger, however, made matters uglier. There was Colonel Denham's name, with a note about his nephew's failing garage. There was Mrs. Calthorpe's son, with mention of speculation in motor bicycles. Mother pledged support. Even Mrs. Pritchard's name appeared, discreetly attached to loan for choir robes. Half the village? Muttered the inspector. No wonder everyone had a motive. And what of Mr. Blake? Miss Marple asked. Green flipped pages. Here. Blake. £50. Insolent. Pressure useful. He closed the book with a snap. This seals it. If Blake didn't do the murder, one of these others did. And whoever held the ledger until now, they're our killer, or close to him. Word of the ledger's existence could not be contained. By evening, the whole of Willowbrook buzzed with indignation and fear. Mrs. Calthorpe took to her sofa with smelling salts. Colonel Denham raged about dishonourable tactics. Mrs. Pritchard held her head high but dismissed her maid early, unwilling to be overheard. At the vicarage tea-table, where Miss Marple happened to be present, the conversation grew heated. It's monstrous, Mrs. Pritchard declared, to put such things in writing. False, every one of them. Not all false, Colonel Denham retorted, his moustache quivering. The man was a blackguard, yes, but he knew how to use information. We'd best admit the truth. Any one of us had cause enough to rid the village of him. The room fell silent at this bold statement. Iris Vale looked stricken. Edmund sat rigid, his fists clenched. Miss Marple, her knitting needles gleaming faintly in the lamplight, spoke softly into the hush. Indeed, Colonel, and yet cause is not the same as courage, nor as cunning. To poison a cup, to lure a man with a voice from nowhere, to empty a safe and then plant a ledger, these are not the acts of one driven by sudden anger. They are the acts of one who planned very carefully. And planning, you know, leaves its trace, even in the neatest hand of all. Her words were mild, but her eyes travelled around the table. Each face shifted under their gaze, some with guilt, some with indignation, some with fear. Miss Marple bent her head again to her knitting. The pattern was almost complete. Chapter 11. Threads pulled tight. By Tuesday, Willowbrook had become a village of locked doors and shuttered blinds. Where once neighbours had lingered over garden gates, now conversations were held behind drawn curtains. The ledger had poisoned more than Mr. Howard's tea. It had poisoned trust. Colonel Denham avoided Mrs. Calthorpe in the High Street. Mrs. Pritchard, hitherto the soul of bustling hospitality, kept to her drawing-room, and Mrs. Webb went about with the air of one who had always suspected the worst, and was grimly gratified to see it proven. Miss Marple, from her quiet seat near the window, observed it all with the mild patience of one who knows human nature requires time to show its true shape. She was waiting, not idly but attentively, for the next small slip that would betray the hand behind the crime. It came, as such things often do, in an apparently trivial remark. She was at Mrs. Calthorpe's parlour, listening to the lady's ceaseless anxieties, when Mrs. Calthorpe said quite suddenly, "And to think, Miss Marple, that dreadful ledger listed even the very cup he drank from, as though it were written down in black and white." Miss Marple's needles paused. "The cup?" "Yes." Mrs. Calthorpe fluttered. The one with blue cornflowers, don't you remember? I told you so at once, and when I heard it read aloud, I thought, why, that's my own witness confirmed. Miss Marple smiled gently. But, my dear, the ledger contained names and debts, not crockery. Perhaps you have confused one memory with another. Mrs. Calthorpe coloured, flustered. Perhaps I have. My nerves, you know. But Miss Marple's mind was already turning. Someone had spoken too readily, too precisely, of details they could only have known by proximity to the act itself. That evening at the vicarage another strand was pulled tight. Inspector Green arrived in some agitation. "The laboratory report is back," he told Miss Marple. "There was cyanide in Howard's cup, yes, but also on the edge of the sugar tongs. Whoever prepared it handled both. Careless work." "Not careless," Miss Marple said softly. "Overconfidence. Some people believe they tidy everything away, when in truth they leave little smudges behind. One does not always need fingerprints, Inspector. A mind will leave its impression too." Green looked at her sharply. "You've something, Miss Marple." "I have something nearly complete," she admitted. "Only one thing more is needed. To see how our friends behave when truth is dangled before them." And so, at her suggestion, the inspector called another gathering for the following evening, ostensibly to read aloud selected portions of the ledger, and to clarify once and for all who had owed what. The announcement caused a sensation. The villagers, already taut with suspicion, could scarcely contain themselves. Colonel Denham blustered that it was highly irregular. Mrs. Calthorpe wept that her son's name would be disgraced. Iris Vale trembled. Edmund clenched his jaw. Even Mrs. Pritchard grew pale, though she declared stoutly she had nothing whatever to hide. Miss Marple said very little. She sat with her knitting, the quiet rhythm of her needles concealing the keen attention of her mind. For she knew that when secrets are threatened with daylight, the guilty rarely sit still. The trap, carefully prepared, was about to be sprung. Chapter 12. The Ledger. Reading the vicarage drawing-room had never hosted such a tense assembly. Curtains were drawn tight against the evening, lamps glowed softly, and the ledger lay open upon the vicar's writing desk like a sacred, or profane, text. The villagers arrived in twos and threes, each carrying their indignation or dread like a cloak about their shoulders. Colonel Denham stood stiffly by the fireplace, moustache bristling. Mrs. Calthorpe fluttered upon the sofa, her shawl clutched tightly as though it might shield her from disgrace. Iris Vale sat beside Edmund, her hand trembling in his, while Mrs. Webb glared around her with sharp disapproval. Mrs. Pritchard presided from the tea-tray, though her usual briskness was subdued by a faint tremor in her voice. Inspector Green cleared his throat. "We are here," he began, "to set down in plain hearing what was written by Mr. Lionel Howard. It is not pleasant reading, but truth rarely is. Each name in this ledger corresponds to an entry: money borrowed, favours owed, indiscretions noted." A collective shiver passed through the room. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in her corner, knitting in her lap, her eyes lowered but attentive. She had asked for this gathering. She knew that fear, when stirred in the right manner, loosens more than one tongue. The inspector read aloud a few entries. Colonel Denham, for the garage. Mrs. Calthorpe's son, for motor bicycle speculation. Mrs. Pritchard, for choir robes. Each denial came quickly, indignantly, yet the words in Howard's neat hand admitted no argument. Then came the name that made the air in the room tighten. Iris Vale. Green read. £100. Discretion demanded. Iris gave a low cry. Edmund half rose, his face flushed. "It's a lie," he shouted. "Howard threatened her. He twisted her past into shame." "Sit down, Blake," Green said sharply. "The book speaks for itself." But it was not the words that interested Miss Marple. It was the faces, the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Calthorpe, the quick glance between Mrs. Webb and Mrs. Pritchard, the way Colonel Denham's eyes narrowed, not at Iris, but at the ledger itself, as though its very presence disturbed him. When silence returned, Miss Marple lifted her head. "If I might, Inspector," she said gently, "there is one entry you have not read aloud, one that tells us more than all the rest." Green looked down, puzzled. "Which is that, Miss Marple?" "The one that is, not there," she replied serenely. "The death that must have been recorded yet is missing, for Mr. Howard recorded everything. And yet, curiously, there is no mention of Mrs. Pritchard's second loan, nor of the matter she was most anxious to conceal." All eyes turned. Mrs. Pritchard's colour drained. "How dare you—" she began, but Miss Marple's voice continued, calm and inexorable. "You see, the ledger was not returned intact. Pages were removed. Carefully, yes, but not without trace. The stitching is loose here, the numbering uneven. Someone kept back what was most dangerous to themselves and allowed the rest to be found, as bait. That, I think, is why it reappeared at so opportune a moment." Inspector Green bent over the book, his brow furrowing. "By Jove, you're right. A section's been cut away." The room erupted. Protests, denials, flutterings. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, then were laid aside. She looked up with the gentle finality of one pronouncing a verdict. "The truth, my dear friends, is that the murderer is among us still, and has been guiding us with little tricks. The voice from nowhere, the paperweight, the planted ledger. Clever, yes, but cleverness always leaves its shadow." Her eyes rested, mild but piercing, upon one face. That person shifted, stiffened, and then tried, too late, to compose themselves. "Tomorrow," Miss Marple said softly, "we shall speak of how it was done, and why. Tonight perhaps we had better all go home and reflect." The gathering broke up in murmurs and glances, each villager more anxious than before. Inspector Green lingered, baffled but deferential. "You've got it, haven't you, Miss Marple?" he whispered. She smiled, her hands folding once more around her knitting. "Yes, Inspector. I think the pattern is clear at last. But one must be patient, you know. A net is best drawn in when the fish have ceased struggling." And outside, beyond the lamplight of the vicarage, Willowbrook's lanes lay dark and wet, the rain falling steadily, as though to wash away the villagers' quiet pretenses, and leave only the truth behind. Chapter 13. The Final Trap. The following evening the vicarage once again filled with strained faces and nervous voices. Inspector Green had sent word that everyone connected with the fete, or with Mr. Howard's affairs, was to attend. No one dared refuse. Even Mrs. Pritchard, pale and tight-lipped, swept in with a dignity that faltered only in the tremor of her hands. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting upon her lap. She looked every inch the elderly spinster, demure and harmless, yet her blue eyes were bright with quiet certainty. She had set her snare. Now the time had come to draw it closed. Inspector Green stood stiffly by the desk, the ledger before him. "We are here," he said, "to hear Miss Marple's conclusions. She has been of help to the police before, and I see no reason not to hear her now." A little ripple of surprise and indignation went round the room, but Miss Marple only inclined her head. "You see," she began gently, "the murder of Mr. Howard was not the act of a hot-headed young man, nor the impulse of a debtor driven to despair. It was a crime carefully planned, with cruelty and cunning. The poison in the cup, the voice that summoned him, the paperweight left in place of the keys, and finally the ledger. Each was a little trick, a piece of misdirection. And tricks, you know, are seldom the province of the simple." Colonel Denham harumphed. Mrs. Calthorpe fluttered. Mrs. Webb sniffed. Mrs. Pritchard sat rigid, her face very white. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but inexorable. "Consider first the voice. It was not a ghost, but a wireless speaker. Someone had access to such equipment, and someone who understood that Howard, brusque though he was, would not ignore a polite summons given in a lady's tone. But no voice was borrowed at random. It was a voice imitated, a voice Howard knew." Inspector Green frowned. "But whose?" Miss Marple's eyes travelled round the room and rested, finally, upon Mrs. Pritchard. "Yours, my dear," she said quietly. "The vicar's wife, the very embodiment of propriety. Who would doubt your summons?" Indeed, Howard did not. A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Pritchard's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then lay still in her lap. The poison was ready in the cornflower cup. Howard took it, trusting, because he believed you had called him. And later, when suspicion began to spread too wide, the ledger appeared, but not whole. The most dangerous pages had been removed, the ones that implicated you. For you, Mrs. Pritchard, had borrowed more than for choir robes. There was another entry, a private matter, one you could not bear to see exposed. Mrs. Pritchard's face crumpled. A sob broke from her. "He would have ruined Arthur," she cried suddenly, her voice sharp with desperation. "My husband, our vicar. He had written a foolish letter years ago, lending his name to a speculation. Howard kept it, waiting, threatening to disgrace him. I could not let that happen. I could not." "Ah." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "You wish to protect him. But murder, Mrs. Pritchard, is a very final form of protection." The vicar, who had been silent and bewildered, gave a broken cry. "Margaret! Oh, my dear!" Inspector Green stepped forward grimly, but Miss Marple lifted her hand. "A moment, if you please. There is one more thing to say." She looked around the room, her eyes resting for a moment on each stricken face. "We must remember that Mrs. Pritchard was not wicked by nature. She was frightened, desperate, and thought she could be clever enough to protect what she loved. Many crimes begin so. But poison, deceit, and trickery, these do not remain hidden. They unravel like a dropped stitch, and in the end the whole pattern is revealed." Silence followed. Mrs. Pritchard sat bowed, her dignity crumbling into tears. The vicar put his hands to his face. Colonel Denham muttered something about damnable business. Mrs. Calthorpe sobbed into her shawl. At last Inspector Green spoke. "I must do my duty." His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her face calm but sorrowful. Another village crime, another soul undone by fear and pride. Outside, the rain had ceased, and the lanes lay washed clean beneath a pale moon. But within Willowbrook, the stain of murder would linger. Chapter 14. Aftermath. In the days that followed Mrs. Pritchard's confession, Willowbrook moved as if in a dream. The arrest was conducted with as much quietness as could be managed, but no village has yet been found in which such a matter passes unnoticed. Curtains twitched, footsteps lingered, and whispers followed the inspector and his men as they escorted the vicar's wife away. The vicar himself bore the blow with a broken dignity. On Sunday he read the service in a voice that faltered only once, and then carried on with bowed head. The parishioners, moved by compassion, sang more softly than usual, as though afraid that strength of sound might break what little remained of his composure. Miss Marple observed it all with her usual serenity. She neither excused nor condemned. To her, human frailty was no stranger. She had seen too many souls undone by pride, fear, or misplaced love. And though she felt pity for Mrs. Pritchard, she felt greater pity for the village itself, which must now reconcile its picture of respectability with the truth that wickedness had sat among them, pouring tea and arranging flowers. At the grocer's, Mrs. Larkin declared that she had always suspected Mrs. Pritchard to be a bit too particular, while Mrs. Calthorpe sobbed that she would never again feel safe at a church fete. Colonel Denham blustered about the tragedy of weak women, though Miss Marple noted privately that he seemed relieved his own debts would no longer be spoken of aloud. Edmund Blake, though still restless and proud, held his head higher now. With Iris Vale beside him, he thanked Miss Marple in his awkward, grudging way. "You saved me from being hanged, ma'am," he muttered, "though I dare say you think me a fool all the same." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Foolishness, Mr. Blake, is often cured with time. Murder, I fear, is not." One evening, some weeks later, she sat in the vicarage garden with the Reverend Pritchard, who had asked her company in his sorrow. The roses drooped in the late summer heat, and the bees hummed drowsily. "She was not wicked," he said at last, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Only frightened." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Frightened people can do desperate things. She loved you, you see, and love, when mixed with fear, can turn very dark indeed." He sighed deeply. "And you, Miss Marple, how did you see what none of us did?" She folded her hands in her lap, her voice quiet. "Because, Mr. Pritchard, people are very much alike, whether in London or in a small village. I once knew a woman who placed her husband upon a pedestal and would not allow him to stumble. She too did a dreadful thing to keep him from shame. It never succeeded. Truth always works its way free, like a root through stone." They sat together in silence until the light faded. When Miss Marple returned at last to her little cottage, she paused at the gate. The village lay peaceful once more. Smoke rose from chimneys, a child's laughter echoed down the lane, and the church clock chimed the hour. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm, though a shadow lingered beneath its calm. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Villages, she knew, were like gardens. You tended them, cherished them, and thought them tranquil. Yet beneath the flowers roots twined together, unseen, and sometimes one found a poisonous growth among the roses. It was her gift, and her burden, to notice such things. She went indoors, lit her lamp, and took up her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steadily, as outside the evening deepened into night. And so in Willowbrook, the voice that had spoken from nowhere was silent at last. Chapter 15. Epilogue. The village returns to quiet autumn came early to Willowbrook that year. The linden leaves turned yellow and drifted softly onto the green, covering the memory of bunting and trestle tables. Life, with the stubbornness of English villages, resumed its familiar rhythm. Children walked to school with satchels swinging. Mrs. Larkin rattled the post office window each morning, and Colonel Denham could be seen marching briskly toward the smithy, as though the war had never ended. Yet beneath the surface things were not quite as they had been. People spoke more softly of one another, hesitated before repeating a story, and looked twice before assuming respectability meant safety. The Reverend Pritchard remained at his parish, his dignity bruised but not destroyed. In time, sympathy replaced scandal, and the congregation, with English reticence, behaved as though nothing had happened, save that Mrs. Pritchard's absence was felt most keenly when the altar flowers were poorly arranged. Mrs. Calthorpe recovered her spirits and declared she would never again be taken in by appearances. Mrs. Webb continued to scrub Rose Lane until the stone gleamed with disapproval. Iris Vale and Edmund Blake, after many whispered conferences on the green, were seen more often walking together of an evening, their quarrels softened by shared trial. Even Colonel Denham, though blustering, seemed quieter, his debts forgiven by the silence of others. As for Miss Marple, she sat one afternoon with her knitting in the little parlour of her cottage, visited by Iris, who brought a posy of late Michaelmas daisies. "I do not know how to thank you, Miss Marple," the girl said earnestly. "You saved Edmund, and me. We were both caught in a tangle we did not understand." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking steadily. "My dear, most tangles unravel themselves if one is patient enough. People's actions, like stitches, show their pattern sooner or later. Mrs. Pritchard's tragedy was that she believed she could unpick a line without the whole knitting falling to pieces. But life does not permit it." Iris sighed. "It all seems so peaceful now, as though nothing had happened." "Peaceful," Miss Marple agreed softly, "but not unchanged. Villages remember, even when they pretend to forget. It will linger, like the scent of lavender in a drawer, faint, but never wholly gone." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple rose and looked out at the lane. Children played in the puddles left by a morning shower. A milk cart rattled by. The church bell tolled the half hour. To any stranger, Willowbrook would seem the very picture of tranquillity. But Miss Marple knew better. Human nature does not change, whether in St. Mary Mead, Marleycombe, or Willowbrook. Beneath every rose hedge lies a thorn. Behind every charming smile, a motive waiting to be uncovered. She smiled faintly, took up her knitting again, and murmured to herself, "Yes, all quite ordinary. Until next time." And with that, the quiet little cottage on the edge of Willowbrook fell into peace, the needles clicking softly, steadily, as if keeping time with the eternal rhythms of village life. Chapter 16. Postscript at St. Mary Mead. Some weeks later, Miss Marple returned to her own village of St. Mary Mead. Life there, too, had its gentle rhythms, the church flowers, the Women's Institute, the endless battle of roses against green fly. She slipped back into it as though she had never been away. Yet as she sat one afternoon with her old friend Mrs. Bantry, sipping tea by the window, she found herself recounting in her quiet way the curious affair at Willowbrook. "It was the voice that puzzled me most," she said. "Voices, you know, are such distinctive things. We think we are safe in our own tones, but they can be borrowed, imitated, even disembodied. Poor Mrs. Pritchard thought she could use cleverness to protect her husband, never realizing that cleverness, once displayed, betrays itself." Mrs. Bantry shivered with delighted horror. "Fancy, at a village fête too! It quite gives me the creeps to think of teacups and poison. One expects such things in novels, not among jam stalls and raffles." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved serenely. "That, my dear, is where one is most mistaken. Murder is very seldom grand or theatrical. It is the small setting, the ordinary teacup, the familiar face. That is where wickedness hides most comfortably." Mrs. Bantry looked at her with a mixture of admiration and unease. "You do see the worst in people, Jane." Miss Marple smiled, faint but kind. "Not the worst, Dolly. Only the truth. And truth, when looked at steadily, is not so frightening as we suppose. It is the lies that make the world uneasy." Outside, the autumn sun slanted over St. Mary Mead's tidy roofs, and the church bell chimed the hour. Miss Marple sipped her tea, adjusted her ball of wool, and set her needles clicking once more. The matter of Willowbrook was finished. Another village, another tangle of human weakness unravelled. Life went on, as it always does, and Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and quiet ways, remained its most watchful guardian.